Sarah from Women in Urbanism, and thank you so much for attending today, especially after work. Not sure where the 5 o'clock time appeared, but anyway, like I said, if you can all be on mute, and yeah, it's like super cool that we can run these webinars so quickly and that we can access all these amazing resources and brain power. A little bit about Kirsty Wild. Kirsty Wild is a research fellow in the School of Public Population Health at the University of Auckland, an environmental sociologist by training. She is interested in the impact of our environments on our physical and mental health. Particularly interested in active transport, her favourite paper she has written recently is one called "Why Are Cyclists the Happiest Commuters?" Today, Kirsty will talk about exploring the relationships between mental health and transport in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, Kirsty, please take it from here. If you want to share your screen, it would be fantastic.
Thanks, Ali. Okay, I'll just share my screen, hopefully. Cool. Here we go. Okay, kia ora, everyone. Thanks for coming along today to talk about mental health and transport. I'm really interested to hear everyone's thoughts about it too. This is like a really new area of research, kind of for everyone, and particularly for us in New Zealand. So shout out to Simon Kingham, really, and Ministry of Transport for putting this on the agenda. So I've kind of been interested in mental health and transport for a little while. I've had maybe 5 years working on bike projects mainly, and I did some research on e-biking a while back. And even though I was kind of asking people about e-biking, I found that people wanted to talk a lot about this experience and like why they switched to an e-bike. This is actually Auckland motorway in the 60s and the Southern motorway and today. So yeah, so they wanted to talk quite a lot about congestion stress. And then I had another experience. I got asked by the Herald to comment on the effects of super commuting. And this is like the positive spin they kind of put on it with Matilda and what's his name here commuting from Warkworth to Auckland. But I kind of thought, yeah, that is an interesting topic. I know quite a few super commuters because I come from Mangawhai up in Northland. And just looking at the national research around it, yeah, it seems to have a pretty negative effect on people's lives in terms of people's relationships, way more likely to be getting divorced if you're super commuting, much less likely to enjoy your family life, more likely to be taking time off work, whole lot of negative things. Anyway, it just made me wonder, you know, what research are we sort of doing in this space? What do we know about the effects on mental health, family life, quality of life around transport? So I sort of started to dig into a few things like this, like what does satisfaction look like by mode? You know, what sort of things impact on transport satisfaction? I will come back and talk about this one again. What are all the different sort of measures that you can use? What do people use? Things like the effect on our mood or travel satisfaction, life satisfaction, or some of the sort of clinical measures of mental health like anxiety, depression, or antidepressant use. So yeah, I sort of filtered through all this stuff thinking about this in a New Zealand context and in relation to my biking data set that I had. And we wrote this paper looking at, I showed you that graph a couple back, like why cyclists and active transport users might be the happiest commuters. Like why is this? It came up quite a bit in our e-biking research, so we wrote this paper on it. So that was sort of what got me interested in mental health and transport, just because it came up a lot as a theme, but I could see that there hasn't been heaps written about it, even in an international context, like it's sort of an emerging field, but certainly very little has been written about it in a New Zealand context. I've got this weird thing where I can't see my own slides. Hang on a minute. Sorry, I'll just try and figure out how to, oh, there we go. Oh no, that's not it. This is really wordy, so don't worry about it. I've just put it there. this is our study for the Transport Agency. So anyway, the study came up trying to look at the relationship between transport and mental health in a local context, doing a lit review, looking at New Zealanders' experience of urban transport around mental health, both in terms of our direct experience as transport users, but also the secondary effects of traffic on our mental health, and looking at providing some recommendations around how we can design our transport systems in ways that improve mental health. It's an exploratory study. Like, we're trying to go quite wide and really think about what are the relationships, what are the causal pathways. Really want to think about mental health in holistic terms as something that affects the whole population. It's not just people with a mental illness or tangata whaiora. In the local lingo, people seeking wellness from mental health challenges. An evidence review, and we're going to look at some secondary data sets as well as some collect some primary data as well. I'll talk about this stuff more. It's a big research team. I'm part of it with a range of researchers with expertise in both transport and mental health, including Māori and Pacific mental health. I have Sunny Collins, who's a social psychiatrist. I thought maybe it might be useful to start with just talking about mental health in a New Zealand context and what's happening with our mental health. I mean, this is really common internationally that we're seeing a rise in psychological distress or mental illness in our communities. Particularly affects some groups more than others. So kids, we're seeing more of an increase in both anxiety disorders and emotional problems in our kids. And here's one by ethnicity and gender, and you'll see that the solid lines are women. So women in general are more likely to experience mental health challenges, and you can see from this graph, I don't know whether it's big enough for you to see, but Māori and Pacific women are particularly likely to, and Māori women have seen the biggest increase. And so that's another one by age. So you can see kids there, 15 to 24, actually that's adolescents is the top line, who are the ones who are experiencing the biggest increase in psychological distress. So how do you kind of define mental health? I just talked about a clinical measure, psychological distress, from our health survey, but it's quite broad. This is the World Health Organization's definition. It's a state in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Really wanted to make sure that I incorporated some Māori and Pacific visions of mental health and well-being there, and as I said, thought about it in terms of like it being a population level issue, not just focusing on, which there can be a tendency sometimes to focus on like mental health consumers, like someone with schizophrenia trying to use a train, which is important, but like mental health is an issue for all of us. So after a bit of going backwards and forwards, we had just had not that long ago, end of 2018, we had a big inquiry into mental health and addiction in New Zealand, Aotearoa, significant community consultation, work with Māori and Pacific mental health professionals, consumers as well. And as part of that work, they really identified in a local context what are 4 key components of a holistic approach to mental health in New Zealand context. Mental health being a function of meaningful work, healthy relationships with our family and whānau and community, good physical health, and a strong connection to land, culture, and history. So we've really settled on that as the 4 components of mental health that we want to work with in this study. Also, a commitment to the World Health Organization really emphasizes the importance of understanding mental health across the life course. Positive and negative effects accumulate as we get older. So keeping that in mind, what effect does transport have on mental health at these different really critical stages of our life? When do we, what stages of life do we perhaps know something about? Where are we missing information about? And the other really important thing that I wanted to try and tease out a bit, when I started to look at the data, I could see that it was really clear that you get these individual trip effects, the effects on you when you're making that journey. But then you also see mental health effects at a neighborhood level, the effects on that neighborhood that you traverse when you make a trip. And then also there's effects at the community level in terms of things like, how much employment or income is available in a community, and how does the transport system affect that. So really wanted to make sure that we tried to think about the effects at the different levels as well, across the lifespan, different scales of effects. So I want to talk a little bit about mostly today about what we've found in terms of looking at what do we know in an international context, what do we know in a New Zealand context about these 4 key components of mental health. And I'm really keen to get feedback from you guys too about what you think matters in terms of exploring this relationship. So I'll probably just talk about some of the highlights and things that have been really interesting. As I say, it's just not something that we've really particularly explored in the New Zealand context. We don't really do research on it. We don't have a sort of systematic strategy around checking in with our population. How is your transport affecting your mental health? So looking at, it's mainly overseas research, but it's interesting. In general, like thinking about work, a lot of our trips are work trips. There's quite a bit of research on how commuting affects our mental health. In general, it tends to lower our mood. Like we prefer it less than other activities, I should say. But the mode you use and the time you spend doing it and the amount of social connection that it provides really matter. In general, active transport users are the happiest commuters and public transport users the least. Time really matters. After about 20 minutes of commuting, our mood tends to decline, and after about 40 minutes, our life satisfaction declines, and 60 to 90 minute trips are particularly tough on our mental health. I'm just gonna, sorry, I'm just gonna check out what's happening with being able to see anyone. I'm just going to continue on. I can't see anyone at the moment. All I can see is my
these 23 of us online.
Oh, that's good. I'm just, if anyone's like waving, saying stop, or I want to say something, I just can't see that at the moment. I don't know when I've done something weird technically, whereas I can only see my PowerPoint. So maybe you just tell me.
Yeah. I think I've said questions at the end, but if they type anything, I'll let you know.
Okay. So I just flagged this stuff because I think it's really interesting. As I said, active transport users tend to be the happiest. Public transport users the least when it comes to commuting. But for people who are using a car or a bus or a train, a whole lot of other conditions matter. Not so much for active transport users, but things like whether you're driving alone, whether you're driving in congested conditions, and how crowded it is really particularly reduce like how much people enjoy using different modes. It's kind of interesting. It won't surprise anyone that people like using the train more than the bus, mainly just because of the reliability of trains, and sometimes they can be less crowded. Really interesting stuff on the effect on mood. Mood can be kind of transitory. I mean, we've kind of had this traditional idea that you can just suck it up, even if your commute is awful, like you just suck it up and then you arrive and, you've got access to this great job and then it's all fine. But mood is kind of like if something's persistently stressful or persistently depressing or whatever, it's going to affect your mental health long term. So we're seeing more research on mood, and transport. Like you can ping people while they're traveling, or you can ask them to report afterwards. We kind of consistently see this relationship. People who drive are the most likely to find their commute stressful. People using PT are most likely to find it depressing or boring. People who walk are most likely to find their commute relaxing, and people who cycle are most likely to find it exciting. I kind of argue, I think that the psychological research shows that that's a real combination of control, the combination of control and sort of arousal that you experience when you use different modes. So both PT and walking tend to be quite low arousal, but and cycling and driving tend to be quite high arousal. So you need to concentrate a lot, you need to be looking around, you need to be on the ball. But walking and cycling tend to be high control, whereas PT and driving tend to be quite low control. And when you get a combination of high stimulation and low control, like driving, that's when you experience stress. When you get that combination of low arousal and low control with PT, that's when you can feel bored. With walking, you get that combination of low levels of arousal but high levels of control. You know, you kind of can figure out where to direct your attention. That tends to be relaxing. Cycling, high arousal but also like a high level of control, which cyclists talk about really enjoying. There's clear differences around commuting stress. Women have higher levels of commuting stress, mainly just because their journeys are, they have more places to be, they've got more things to do, the multitasking, and commuting is more stressful for low-income people. Disability and people with mental health challenges, it won't surprise anyone that journeys are often more stressful for them. More challenges around navigating any sort of transport system. And here's just one, it's just a snippet of a piece around the sorts of cognitive skills that are involved in using different modes of transport. You can see walking compared to using a bus, like there's just so many steps involved in using a bus compared to walking. So sort of unsurprisingly, and that's sort of early feedback we've got from talking to people about who work with people with mental illness as well, like walking is really preferred. It's like, I mean, I kind of showed you that, this one here, like it's the most relaxing, high control, not too stressful mode. But, you know, as a result, I mean, if you're kind of reliant on walking, you know, it's limited in terms of how much you can do, how far you can go, how functional you can be if you're ending up walking because all the other modes are too stressful. Not so much done on cycling and mental health, but there's been a cool study of a project in Christchurch, actually, looking at increasing access to bikes as a way to help with transport disadvantage amongst people with mental illness, you know, just trying to expand that range from walking, giving people a little bit more independence, but using a mode that they can still have a lot of control over, is not as stressful as using PT. At the community level, I think it's important to talk about mental health and access to meaningful work in relation to unemployment. This is something that just comes up so much in our mental health inquiry, just the really negative impact of unemployment on mental health. I say it because I still think it's such an underappreciated issue. We tend to think about unemployment as something that is kind of a temporary loss of income, but it has a really negative, persistent, long-term impact on mental health. And so it's just particularly low-income communities. They have much higher levels of mental health issues. They have much higher levels of unemployment. So that access to employment is just so critical in terms of mental health for people in low-income communities. And transport just plays such a critical role there. I think I mentioned too that commute stress tends to be more of an issue for people in low-income communities because commute stress is, as I mentioned, like partly when you're driving in particular, a function of the low control created by congestion, and you get that low control experience of driving in congested conditions, sort of adding on to the experience of working in a low control job if you work in a low income community, plus the added impact of the financial stress of trying to run a car. So there's quite a cool recent Australian study that showed that actually people who had to commute out of a low-income community in a car because of that combination of commute stress and the financial stress associated with not really being able to afford to run that car, they had worse mental health than people who were actually stayed at home in that community, which is quite a significant finding because, you know, a lot of those people staying home are probably experiencing unemployment, which is has quite a negative impact on mental health. So the fact that it's actually less stressful to be unemployed and at home than going out to commute from a low-income community, if you have to commute in congested conditions and you can't really afford to run that car. There's also just the issue of transport cost, I think, particularly in relation to mental health at the community level. There's just lots of research that points out that transport costs really matter in low-income communities, not just because it's a struggle for individuals, but it just really, every dollar counts in terms of how much money can circulate in that community, and that really makes a difference around employment. So keeping transport costs low is just really important for the economic development of poorer communities, and that just has a huge impact on their mental health. The second theme that came out of our mental health inquiry was our relationships with our family, our whānau, and our community. In terms of at that individual level, when we make a trip, the mode we use really matters for our mental health. So people particularly who use the slower modes, which actually includes PT, and open ear modes, they make more eye contact when they're out. They see more of what goes on in their neighbourhoods. They like their neighbourhoods more, and they get more social interaction. There's lots of research, which I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone about, around the role of active transport, giving kids in particular opportunities for independent travel, exploring their neighbourhoods, making friends, really important for their psychological health. And family connection is an interesting one. I mean, this is something that comes up around driving with your kids, like your individual trip being a chance to connect with your children. But one of the specialists in child mental health that I was talking to said she felt there'd been a little bit of a decline in this in terms of the use of screens now during trips with your kids. Neighborhood. I once again, I'm sure that you guys have all heard of the concept of community severance, like the impact that traffic trips have on our possibilities to connect with other people. That if you've got a lot of car traffic in particular in your communities, much fewer opportunities for you. Kids have less friends. Actually, everyone has less friends. Kids like their neighbourhoods less if they're living in high traffic neighbourhoods. And there's also a recent interesting study on cognitive development in children. It even showed that if you're in a high traffic environment, kids have more delayed cognitive development because spatial development is a really important part of cognitive development in childhood, and that if you are driven around everywhere and you don't get that chance to explore your neighbourhood, it actually delays your cognitive development. So that combination of being driven everywhere and not getting to explore your neighbourhood actually delays the cognitive development of kids. Physical health, I won't go on about this too much, only to say that it's a bi-directional relationship. Physical health really impacts on our mental health, and mental health impacts on our physical health. People with mental health issues, it tends to, partly because of the medication that they are on, and also just isolation, etc., affects their physical health. So anything where you can get people to be physically active as part of their transport boosts mood, improves their physical health. There's a recent study looking at 15 years of the census data showed that cycling in particular is associated with a 13% reduction in all-cause mortality, including suicide. And I'd say that probably another big issue around physical health and mental health that we haven't explored in New Zealand, there hasn't been any research around it, but it'd be interesting to look at, is the impact of traffic injury. So this is a terribly cluttered slide, but between 2015 and 2017, we had about 6,000 serious injuries and 62,000 minor injuries on our urban roads. So the research shows that about half of people in that serious injuries category would have significant psychological distress, probably even at the 12-month mark, and a number at the 3-year mark after a serious car accident. So it's probably not something that we've explored much, but it probably has a significant psychological toll in our community. Air pollution is a really interesting one in terms of thinking about neighbourhood effects. Oh, where am I? We don't know if air pollution is a mental health issue. Certainly in Europe, it seems to affect how people rate their quality of life. If they feel like there's an air pollution issue, they tend to feel less positive about their quality of life. Noise pollution is definitely a transport and mental health issue. So it's estimated that we have about 60 deaths as a result of noise pollution. About a third of people in our big cities say that they're annoyed or extremely annoyed by traffic noise. And it's like a directly mental health related transport form of mortality or morbidity, like ill health, because traffic noise it activates your threat detection system, basically, which causes heart disease. It's not something that's consistently or well monitored in New Zealand, the impact of traffic noise pollution on mental health, but definitely something that I think it should be monitored more. Transport and a strong connection to land, culture and history, obviously something that's particularly important to Māori and Pacific people, but comes up as an issue for everyone, particularly around our ability to access green space. We actually have quite good access to green space in New Zealand, in our cities, even across income in relation to different areas in the city, but there's probably not heaps of measurement about the quality of that. But there was definitely quite a good study last year looking at the relationship between the emotional health of adolescents and how much access they have to green space, to native species, definitely much lower levels of depression amongst teenagers who have good access to green space. The active modes in general have more access to green space just as part of their trips, and everyone identifies this as a great thing about using an active mode. And it's interesting to see, looking at some of the research around Māori use of active modes too, that it's often used as in part of like Māori cycling programs, building in opportunities to kind of learn about the natural environment as part of cycling and walking programs, learn about medicinal plants. In terms of connection to land, culture and history, just thinking about the importance of Māori mental health and transport, there's a real emphasis on shared mobility, on being together when you travel, and on accessing places of cultural significance, marae, papakainga, and I think some evidence that what's called psychoterratic stress, so being cut off from natural places of cultural significance, is potentially more of an issue for Māori in particular around transport infrastructure, motorways going through special places, etc. So yeah, I would say that there are some real obvious knowledge gaps, things that we want to think about, starting to find out more about. Travel satisfaction in general, we don't really measure it. There might be kind of consumer satisfaction studies out there in parts of our transport system, but it's a bit broader than that, and it'd be good to be thinking about how it impacts on our quality of life, and maybe be collecting some data about that in a more systematic way. Commuting and family life is a really obvious area where all international research shows that we really need to be directing some research resource. Thinking about that WHO model of mental health across the life course, given that international research really highlights the particularly negative impact that long commutes, that more time spent in the car, that high impedance travel, high stress, congested travel has on things like family life in particular. It'd be really great to be thinking about how our transport systems affect some really critical parts of family life at the prenatal sort of attachment and family building stages of life. Child and adolescent mental health and transport, an obvious area that needs further study, given that that's at the sector of our population that is experiencing the biggest, fastest increase in mental health issues. There's been a little bit written about the decline in active transport and the increase in mental health problems amongst teenagers and teenage girls in particular. Be good to follow that up more. And obviously Māori and Pacific mental health and transport, given that that's another part of our population where mental health issues are increasing the fastest. We just have so little capacity in our transport system around researching Māori and Pacific experiences of transport in general. And this is another area where we really need to build capacity. I'd say that there's just like immediately some obvious things around recommendations in terms of improving mental health through our transport system, reducing trip time, trying to get our trips under that 20 minutes where we start to see a decline in our mood. Really particularly trying to reduce high impedance travel, so congested travel in a car, high stress travel, and definitely more than 20 minutes. Increasing use of active modes, they're protective in terms of mental health, and they're alternative to those high stress, high impedance modes. Reducing transport poverty and transport costs. In New Zealand, 30% of people don't use or have access to a car. Some of that is choice, but a lot of that is transport poverty, and it's a significant cause of psychological distress at the individual and the whānau level, as well as denying people access to things like education and health and employment. Improvements to PT and cycling, perhaps particularly in terms of expanding the transport options of tangata whaiora or people experiencing mental health issues, and increasing accessibility, transport accessibility. I mean, it's a bit of a nebulous term, but definitely anything that improves people's access to employment and mental health services in general will improve our mental health. Yeah, so so this is kind of stage one, thinking about the project, thinking about how we're going to explore it in a New Zealand context. I mentioned briefly that we're going to use some existing secondary data sets. I've got my electric city biking one. We've got the Inclusive Streets project, which looks at the experience of older and disabled people, and we're going to collect some data directly, which I started doing, but then we had lockdown and everyone I was interviewing were essential workers, so I've held off on that, with people who work with people really who have mental health challenges. So I'm interested to hear in everyone's thoughts around mental health and transport, what you might know in terms of work in your own organisations or your own experiences in your own work or projects. Yeah.
Awesome.
Or any questions?
Question.
Hey, thanks, Kirsty. Hey, I've managed to share the road campaign. We work with heavy vehicle drivers and people that ride bikes. Have you ever looked at bullying on the road, on-road bullying, and potentially relationships between bullying on the road and in the home, at the workplace?
That's a really interesting question. And do you are you asking that in relation to cyclists feeling bullied, or what are you?
Well, I haven't done any research on bullying, but
Yeah.
you know, what you read in the paper and things like that, you know, there sometimes people get bullied. They kind of somehow attract it. Maybe it's for any number of reasons, and there are definitely people out there that bully. And I just wonder, does that translate into the road environment? Or, you know, some of you may remember that Donald Duck cartoon, or it was actually Goofy years ago, how he was a nice friendly guy walking around, and when he jumped into the car he turned into a demon.
Oh yes, yes.
So, you know, the effect of it for the person being bullied, and you know, I believe it does happen, is shocking.
Yeah.
If that's been part of anything you've looked at.
Yeah. So I think the way our road system is designed at the moment does kind of facilitate that or encourage that type of bullying. I mean, any situation where you sort of get big and small, where you get a big power differential, right? But there's no real consequences to your action, that's going to encourage bullying, you know, where you've got a big, yeah. So that vehicular bullying, perhaps, that you're talking about of other people, I mean, it's interesting. There was one really great Australian study that looked at that, and the real difference in how we treat people if we have to meet them in the street and look at them compared to if we're in a car, and how people treat other people, because there's no real consequences. There's a big power difference. So I think that actually it is a systemic issue.
I think it's the same. I was going to say that's quite similar to cyber versus in real person, right? Like if you're face to face, you can read someone's emotions or whatnot. You treat them a lot nicer, versus if you've got 2 meters or a meter of separation in your like metal box, it's a lot easier to insult someone and know that, you know, like it's not going to happen. If you insult someone on cyber, you know, yeah, I just thought I'd say there's a similar analogy.
Yeah, definitely. There's that. And then there's a huge power difference, you know. Like, it's easy to bully a cyclist if you're in a truck, but do you, yeah. So I feel that's partly built-in conflict, what I would call built-in conflict, which is actually when people talk about road rage too, you know, that's familiar to us, and there's plenty of research to suggest that's getting worse, because as traffic volumes increase, people's commute stress increases, and so all that stuff around bullying gets even worse. I mean, a stressed person who's inconvenienced by someone else, they're much more powerful than that other person, and there's no consequences to their action. That's just such a fertile environment for bullying.
Sorry, I'm not the person who's meant to answer, but I just thought I'd say I did a cycling, the culture of cycling paper through University of Amsterdam this year, and one of the things they talk about was a paper on like deviant behavior, and it's really interesting how all road users do illegal behavior. So people who walk, people who drive will you know, speed up to go past the lights, or they'll cross fast so to save them time. But cyclists were found to only slightly less do naughty behavior, but their reasoning for it was for safety reason, usually to be visible, but they were scrutinized a lot more. So it's actually like well known that even that everyone does illegal behavior, and the cycling seems like is justified for safety reason, they are scrutinized more. That was just what the study found.
I think there's no...
Of course, yeah. So if there's just one thing I just want to add, and I know I'm taking up a bit of time, I was pedaling up the shared path to our home the other day, and there were people walking in front of me, and I had this little lockdown revelation. Suddenly it occurred to me, why? Because I'm on a bicycle, should they give way to me? Why should I be able to get past just because I'm on a bicycle? And you know, I can go faster, but what difference should that make? And I just wonder if that might be relevant to...
Well, I mean, you're experiencing a tiny skerrick of what we were talking about, in that you are more powerful. You're bigger, you've got that mass, you've got, you know, and to a certain extent, I think about that sometimes, like, sometimes pedestrian groups, advocacy groups can be quite full on about cyclists. And I think it's not always super evidence-based in the sense that cyclists they're quite nimble like pedestrians. They don't actually harm them that often. But, you know, there's a power differential there, definitely. You know, it feels threatening. It feels scary, you know, it feels a bit menacing. And it is a little bit, you know, because of that power differential, that differential of mass. And certainly absolutely scaled up the relationship between a truck and a... But I guess the one thing that I would caution is that I don't think it's... you know, God, I did this terrific interview with this talkback radio person recently, and they were asking me, what is this conflict between cars and cyclists, and what is it about? And I was just trying to explain that it's kind of built-in conflict. I don't think there's anything inherently about people driving hating cyclists. I don't think it's a cultural thing. I think it's a structural thing. You know, you put big and small together, big is much more likely to bully small, especially if they don't have to look them in the eye and there's no consequences. Yeah. Anyone else? Any questions?
No, well, this is more a discussion. I just thought I'd say is interesting. You were talking about like happiness of users, and I actually read Happy Cities, a podcast recently, and they were saying what was interesting is that we know that like people say they hate PT more, or they prefer to drive than use PT, but actually this survey that looked at whole life satisfaction actually found people who took PT and who moved from cars to PT were overall happier, and they thought there might be a link to the fact that a PT journey also includes a walking or cycling journey at the first or last mile. It was just something interesting I thought I'd add.
I think I get asked about the PT thing a lot, and I should say that I don't feel that I'm 100% sure about, like, I think there probably is quite a bit of variation around the quality of PT as well. Like, there's probably a lot of cities where it's more enjoyable to use PT than cars overall. So even somewhere like Amsterdam, PT tends to come out worse, and it's just a function of less control, you know, and crowding. But, you know, I mean, there was this great New Zealand study where he looked at the experience of using a bus, and he just pointed out that he does PhD research. It's just a great thesis. But anyway, he just talked about how much we still prioritize functional aspects of PT over the quality of PT. You know, he said, where else is there? Like, there's even in a prison or in a workplace, like from a health and safety point of view, you would not be allowed to force people to sit that close to other people, because it activates a whole lot of negative psychology. You're basically putting people into other people's intimacy space. So it creates a lot of stress when you crowd people. And in no other area of the community would you be allowed to force people into such close proximity as we do on buses in particular. Trains have a bigger aisle. So, you know, it's sort of not rocket science. We're still designing our PT quite badly in terms of its enjoyment value, I would say.
It's really interesting because I always see PT as a way to take a break. I don't have to drive, and I don't have to make decisions, and it pretty much gets me there. You know, I don't have to find a park.
Yes, I know, and I think there probably is quite a bit of variety. Like if your bus is not crowded, you know, and you're not in a rush, and you know, people have pointed that out to me, that there's probably quite a difference between the commuting experience in PT than the experience of being able to use it throughout the rest of the day as well.
So I commuted by PT as well, so the regular rush hour time. But sorry, just want to say that.
Even if it rates the worst, it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people who prefer it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I guess.
So I don't pretend to be a PT expert, but I know that it pretty consistently, buses in particular are ranked as and I think it's important to talk about it, because I think that we could improve the satisfaction of it through thinking about how to improve the experience of it. Don't crowd people, create more flexibility. Think about user experience more with PT.
I think it probably comes from living in a big city as well, in the sense that public transport in Toronto, for example, is way easier than driving ever would be. You could barely afford to drive, kind of thing. So maybe that's my experience of PT.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are lots of people who it's the most enjoyable way to get around, and part of that's their particular PT experience and their particular PTs in their particular city, their individual preferences, lots of things. Yeah.
And if it's time and cost competitive with the car, that's, in Holland,
completely.
Cycle trips are 5% faster, I think, in the urban centres than cars. That's competitive. It's useful.
I think it's important to talk about, though, because I think there's challenges around trying to get people out of cars into PT if we consistently see it coming through as something that enjoys lower travel satisfaction. I just think that's not a winning prospect long term. We need to, significantly improve transport satisfaction around PT, or we need to have more cycling and walking, which are higher satisfaction, as part of our mix. I mean, in New Zealand, with the healthy transport pyramid, in most European cities, it goes walking, cycling, PT, cars, and I think we'd probably go walking. I don't know if you could say walking, but we probably prioritise PT over cycling in New Zealand most of the time. And I think probably just having a bit more of a mix might help with those issues around travel satisfaction.
Well, it's just reflecting also in the current environment that one of the issues that policymakers are thinking through at the moment is how to attract people back to PT in the post-COVID situation. So that kind of new worry of health comes up, of course. And yet, once people are back to work, obviously there might be a slower trickle of people back to the office as we get to alert level 2. I'm sure not everybody will go back straight away, but still there's a sense and maybe a fear or an awareness, I suppose, that the capacity available on the bus network with 2 meters separation needed, there's a disjunct there with how many people we want to use it. And then eventually, once social distancing isn't required as much, but the comfort that people might feel when they, to encourage them back on it. Because our city will need that desperately.
Yes.
But the active modes obviously have a natural advantage in this environment.
Well, that's what we saw, with the tube bombings in London, or,
true.
A lot of disaster.
That's a good comparison. Yeah.
So we see a shift to cycling in particular. I mean, that's how cycling really took off in London.
Oh, right.
So,
yeah.
There's a definite opportunity for supporting cycling here at the moment. There might be, like the PT, if we want to, it is a real challenge. How do we get people to not shift to cars?
Yeah.
PT will probably be a lot more pleasurable to use for a while, because it'll be
That's right.
a lot less crowded if you actually use it.
Yeah.
But definitely a good time for temporary cycleways. I mean,
and hopefully that's coming too.
Yeah.
90% funding for it floating around, so that's a bonus.
Yeah.
The other small reflection I had was that discussion earlier about bullying and how interesting it is that cycling is still the most positive for people. And yet my personal experience is on a bike is the most time I've experienced bullying.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine how good it would be if there wasn't bullying. Anyway.
I mean, it's despite that, cyclists are still,
that's right.
Although there is some debate about whether there's a bit of a survivor effect, i.e. the people still cycling, other people can cope with the high levels of bullying, basically. And in reality, we know that is true to a certain extent, because it's more likely to be men doing it. It's more likely, like basically people who have a stronger sense of entitlement, are more likely to be okay with just screaming back at men are brought up to feel like bullying is more a part of life, and
boys will be boys, like it's okay.
So there's a bit of debate about that, although we consistently see, and I talk about cycling being the highest satisfaction mode, and I should say that it's, walking is pretty similar. It's just that particular study, I had a cycling data set to explore it. So it's the active mode.
Yeah.
I didn't go into heaps around why that is, but it wouldn't surprise anyone. The high levels of control, the high levels of sensory input, the mood boosting exercise, the opportunities for social connection. Yeah. And they're a bit more variable in the other modes. PT can be really amazing for social connection, and it also can be too crowded. It can be overwhelming, and driving can be really lonely. Actually, driving with someone else, or having a PT companion also rate really well. Yeah. Yes.
There's a bit of a chat about your very interesting comment about the connection between spatial awareness and cognitive development, particularly in children and their neighbourhoods, and how at the moment with everyone, I mean, we do walk around our neighbourhood with our 6-year-old, but in the last month we've done a lot more. And there was some reflections from other attendees about young kids having a wonderful awareness of their, how to get around their local areas and what development that might be. Has there been a boost in cognitive development in the last month, is what I was wondering, for children?
Wow, it's been really, it's an interesting time and kind of a tough time, hasn't it, in terms of readjusting to the traffic coming back. For me as an active transport researcher, I couldn't, as a university researcher, I couldn't get my own study up, and it's kind of a long process to set up a university study. So I couldn't get something up and running really fast, but I did want to support, I support Women in Urbanism to do like a little questionnaire, which some of you might have participated in their experience of neighbourhood during lockdown. And it's just so fascinating, because it's a natural experiment in low traffic living, and that stuff around kids being able to explore definitely comes through. The amount of people talking about teaching their kids to ride a bike, but I tell you, one thing that so comes through is just the general reduction in family anxiety and how much more they enjoy going out as a family when you don't have to be just constantly constantly looking out for your kid, even on the footpath, whether someone's going to drive over your child on the footpath, and people talking about, we go out and we can have conversations as a couple because I'm not spending the whole time just terrified that the kid's going to get hit by something, or going out cycling as a family is now enjoyable as opposed to a stressful or like a chore, or even the traffic noise, how it's like we can go out as a family and we can all hear each other. It's really fascinating in terms of people's responses around the quality of family life in the neighbourhood during lockdown. And as I kind of like a mixed, like it was this weird experience, wasn't it? When you're kind of thrown out of the work world, for me, into back into this world of family and neighbourhood, and then like this amazing thing opened up, this beautiful, amazing thing. And then you're like, wow, and then you're like, oh God, oh no, it's going to be over, So Yeah, it's been a weird time, a weird and beautiful and tough and interesting time. Yeah. I'm sure everyone feels the same. But I'll make sure that I write all that stuff up on that questionnaire, because I'm sure everyone would like to see it. It's really fascinating. Yeah. Lots of things I didn't think about, and, you know, lots of things that people didn't think about until they, you know, like particularly the noise, you know, just not really noticing how much traffic noise gets on their nerves until it's not there.
Yeah.
You know,
A colleague said to me, you know, every day I've been chatting with my friend along a road. This was in Lower Hutt. And yesterday was the first day I was walking along, and I actually couldn't do it. I had to take a new route because it was only like yesterday when the traffic returned that I realized how much the noise affected me, and I couldn't just have a nice discussion on the phone. You know, it was an interesting point she said.
And then there were a couple of people who actually talked about getting older and how as they've gotten older, their hearing's got worse and they find it much harder now out on the street. Or, you know, one woman was like, I can take my grandkid out and we can talk and I can hear him. And, or, you know, it doesn't activate my tinnitus. You know, like there's a clear thing around the being able to talk to each other and being able to enjoy each other. It's, you know, it's very, I found it quite moving and interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Well, if there's no final questions, I'll leave it 1 minute longer. No. Just checking.
I apologise that I wasn't keeping up to date with the chat, but I find people use it to chat with each other rather than the presentation. But thank you everyone for coming, and I am at the University of Auckland. You can easily look me up if there's anything I can ever help with in terms of connecting anyone in with research that helps make the case for anything valuable that they want to get funded or etc. Make stuff happen. I'm really happy to share research from our projects.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for giving up your time. It's awesome, and it's just such a nice space that we can all have this discussion, and it's, you know, a lot of research and really important information, but at the same time it's casual enough that people feel confident enough to ask questions. So really appreciate you giving up your time to come and talk on a Women in Urbanism webinar, and thank you to everyone else, and we will find by next week who will be our next speaker. So thanks all, and it's recorded. See you later.
See ya.
Thank you.